There is a particular kind of cruelty that hides behind closed doors and manicured lawns. It doesn't announce itself with a villain's sneer or a thunderclap of obvious malice. No. It creeps in quietly, disguised as a neighbor's polite nod over the garden fence, a friendly wave from across the street, or even the warm smell of a freshly baked cake left on your doorstep. The people we live beside, those whose morning routines we know by sound, whose cars we recognize before we recognize their faces, these are the people we are supposed to feel safe around. These are the people who make up the invisible walls of the world we call home. But what happens when those walls begin to close in? What happens when the person next door isn't just indifferent to your well-being, but actively, deliberately, and methodically working to destroy it? What happens when you look across the fence and realize that the face smiling back at you is not the face of a neighbor at all, but the face of someone who has decided, for reasons that may never fully make sense to you, that your peace, your safety, and your very sense of home are obstacles to be removed? The stories you're about to hear tonight are real. They were shared by real people, ordinary men and women, who simply had the misfortune of living next door to the wrong person at the wrong time. Some of these stories will make you angry. Some will make your heart ache. Some will send a quiet chill up the back of your neck in the small hours of the night, when the house is quiet and you find yourself listening, really listening, to the sounds coming from just beyond your walls. Because here is the truth that no one tells you when you sign the papers on a new home or unpack your boxes in a new apartment building: you can choose your house, but you cannot choose who lives beside it. You can choose your neighborhood, but you cannot choose the strangers who share it with you. And most of the time, that is perfectly fine. Most of the time, the person next door is just that, a neighbor. Background. Furniture. Someone you wave to on your way to the car. But sometimes, and this is what keeps people awake at night, sometimes they are something else entirely. So settle in. Get comfortable. And remember, as you listen to what these people went through, that every single one of them once felt exactly as safe in their home as you do right now. And then everything changed. If you're new here, welcome. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our community. You are absolutely not going to want to miss what comes next. Our first story tonight comes from a woman who grew up in a perfectly ordinary house, on a perfectly ordinary street, with neighbors who seemed, on the surface, perfectly ordinary too. Until they weren't. So many years ago, my parents still lived in the house where I grew up as a child. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where you knew your neighbors' names and their cars and vaguely their routines. And for the most part, the people on that street were decent, unremarkable folks just getting on with their lives. But then there were the Morrises. Mr. and Mrs. Morris stood out to me, even as a kid. And not in a good way. Mr. Morris was the kind of man you could only ever describe as blustering, loud and red-faced, and always certain that he was the most important person in any given room, even when the room in question was just a driveway or a garden path. He was the sort of man who managed to make a simple good morning sound like a personal criticism. And Mrs. Morris, well. Mrs. Morris was sort of like a human square. And I mean that as literally as possible. She had a bowl haircut, a mustache that was nearly as bushy as her husband's, and the kind of expression that suggested she had just bitten into something deeply unpleasant and was choosing not to mention it. Now, if this description sounds a little uncharitable, I want to be very clear with you: yes, it absolutely is. And I am not the least bit sorry about it. Because by the time this story is over, you are going to feel exactly the same way about these two. Unless, of course, you happen to be a psychopath, in which case, may I gently suggest that a remote cabin in the woods, perhaps somewhere with no neighbors for several miles in every direction, might suit you just beautifully. The Morrises were sternly friendly with my parents, in that cold, transactional way that some people mistake for politeness. They had a son named August, who was involved in the Scouts alongside my older brother Barry. August was essentially a miniature version of his father, bossy, always insisting on being the one in charge of whatever activity was happening, and prone to going quietly, dangerously red in the face when things didn't go his way. We kids in the neighborhood had a nickname for him. One borrowed from the name of a certain Austrian historical figure that I suspect YouTube's content policies would prefer I not say aloud. Let's just say it was not a flattering comparison, and leave it at that. But August isn't really the point of this story. He was eventually shipped off to a military boarding school during high school, and the baffling, almost poetic thing is that he bragged about having asked to go there himself. And so life in our neighborhood carried on, with the Morizes as a constant, bristling presence. They weren't violent. They weren't overtly threatening. They were just, stern. Watchful. The kind of neighbors who would file a noise complaint if your barbecue ran past 9 in the evening, who would frown across the fence if someone's music was slightly too cheerful. And if any ball, a football, a basketball, a tennis ball belonging to me or any of my siblings, happened to sail over the boundary hedge into the Morris garden, you could consider that ball gone. Oh, they would return it eventually. But they would puncture it first. Every single time. My father, being my father, once asked them directly why they kept doing this. They told him, entirely straight-faced, that the balls kept striking sharp objects in their garden and there was simply nothing they could do about it. Sharp objects. In their garden. We always wondered what exactly they were cultivating back there, spiked pits, maybe. Medieval traps. Something with teeth. Over the years, my siblings and I grew up and slowly, one by one, moved out. My brother Barry left for college. A couple of years later, I followed. Then Andy moved out to go traveling. That left just my parents in the house, along with our much younger sibling Sammy, who was only 10 years old when I was 20, practically a different generation. And for a while, things were quiet. Then one day, my mother FaceTimed me in tears. She could barely speak at first. I had to talk her down slowly, carefully, the way you would with someone who had just witnessed something shocking and was still trying to make sense of it. And then my father joined the call, and together they explained what had happened. They had received a legal letter. It had come from a law firm representing the Morizes, and it stated that the boundary hedge between the two properties had been gradually encroaching on the Morris land for years. And as a result of this encroachment, my family now owed them, and this is the part where my jaw dropped, over $400,000 in reparations. The claimed reason was lost revenue from their inability to use the land for the expansion of some unspecified business. The reason they had called me first was simple. At the time, I was studying law. And the moment I heard the details, alarm bells began ringing so loudly in my mind that I could barely think straight. I asked them the most important question first. Exactly how far was this hedge supposedly encroaching on the Morris land? They told me, meekly, that it was 1 inch. 1 inch. They were being taken to court and threatened with a $400,000 bill over 1 inch of hedge. I asked them to scan the letter and send it to me immediately. I made some calls, did some digging, and very quickly discovered what I had already begun to suspect, that the law firm named in the letter was not merely disreputable. It did not exist at all. The Morizes had invented an entirely fictional law firm and used it to send a fraudulent threatening letter to my parents. And the question that consumed me for the next couple of days was, why? Why would they do something this transparent? My parents would obviously seek legal counsel before paying $400,000. What did they possibly hope to achieve? The answer arrived a few days later in the form of a second letter from the same imaginary law firm. This one offered a solution. If my parents would simply agree to move the boundary hedge back 10 feet, granting the Morizes a significantly larger portion of land, the entire matter would be dropped. No money required. Just the land. Now, knowing my parents as I do, I believe with absolute certainty that without a daughter studying law, they might have agreed to that just to make the whole unpleasant business disappear and get back to their quiet life. It would have been entirely in their nature to do so. But I was here now. I pulled the land blueprints and contacted the relevant planning offices, and I discovered the truth beneath the truth. The Morizes had applied for a house extension and had apparently purchased a prefabricated guest house for their back garden. But both projects required them to build onto land that was not theirs, specifically, land that belonged to my parents. The fake legal threat wasn't about a hedge at all. It was about getting the space they needed to build their extension without having to pay for it. I was also, at the time, in a relationship with an older man, who is now my husband, who worked at a law firm specializing in exactly this type of property dispute. He was happy to help. He did some digging, pulled some old records, and discovered something that made the whole situation beautifully ironic. The boundary hedge was not, as the Morizes claimed, encroaching on their land. It was, in fact, approximately a foot inside my parents' property. Meaning the Morizes had, if anything, been inching into our land for years. My boyfriend drafted a legitimate, properly evidenced legal document laying out exactly that. The letter concluded by confirming that my family was generously choosing to let matters rest as they were, so long as the Morizes did the same. We sincerely hoped that being caught in their own lie would be enough to make them stop. We were wrong. We had clearly underestimated just how badly they wanted that extension, or how much money they had already sunk into that prefabricated guest house, presumably non-refundable. And so they changed tactics entirely. The fake lawyers disappeared. In their place came something that, in any other circumstance, you might have assumed was a joke. Ransom notes. I am not joking. Actual, literal ransom notes, assembled from letters cut out of magazines like something from a low-budget crime film. The notes were bizarre in their content. One threatened to kill our family's pet miniature donkey, an animal we had never owned. Another promised to poison the koi in our garden pond. We had no pond. We had no koi. The letters were so strangely disconnected from reality that for a while, my parents kept copies mostly out of sheer disbelief rather than genuine alarm. But then the notes became personal. My parents wouldn't show me the specific contents, but they let slip that the notes had begun to name me and my brothers by name. And then one arrived that mentioned Sammy, sweet, young Sammy, who was still in school, and promised that one day, Sammy would simply not come home. That was when they finally went to the police. The police, of course, couldn't definitively prove that the letters came from the Morizes. And of course they couldn't, because the Morizes were clever enough to make themselves appear to be victims of the same harassment. They reported strange incidents of their own, vandalism to their own property, to ensure that suspicion would not settle too cleanly on them. The harassment lasted 5 years. 5 years of petty vandalism. Graffiti appearing on the walls of the house. Garden hoses clipped in the dead of night, the faucets left running until the yard flooded. Dead birds and roadkill arranged on the doorstep. And then there was the music. Every single Wednesday morning at precisely 3:33 in the morning, classical music would begin blaring at full volume from the Morris property. Not a variation in time, not an occasional lapse. Every Wednesday, without fail, at 3:33 a.m., as reliable as any alarm clock. When Sammy's school exams came around, the Morizes escalated it to every single night. My parents filed noise complaints. The Morizes denied any involvement and claimed, with apparent sincerity, that they actually hated classical music. And somehow, through whatever careful system they had worked out, whenever investigators were present, the music never played. Not once. My eldest brother Barry eventually moved back home and confronted the Morizes directly and forcefully. The Morizes had the extraordinary gall to call the police on him. This further undermined our family's credibility with the authorities, and the Morizes even went as far as suggesting that Barry was responsible for the vandalism, despite the fact that he had been living in another state for the majority of the incidents and had solid alibis for most of them. Meanwhile, Sammy, who had been just a child when all of this began, was becoming a wreck. And the rest of us felt utterly helpless, like we were fighting a war against an enemy who knew every loophole and had infinite patience. It felt like the entire system was working against us, and perhaps in some ways it was. In the end, the whole family gathered for a meeting. And through tears and exhaustion and the kind of heavy sadness that settles into your bones when you've been fighting for too long, we made a decision that none of us wanted to make. We would leave. We put the family home, the house my mother had grown up in, up for sale. My parents accepted the first offer they received. They moved into a smaller house, something more manageable. Something quieter. Something that was just theirs, with no shadow hanging over it. If you've ever been forced to walk away from something you loved because someone else refused to let you have peace, you know exactly what that silence costs. I want to hear from you. Has something like this ever happened to you or someone you love? Leave a comment below and share your story with our community. You are never alone in these experiences. Now, I want to be honest with you. There is no triumphant ending for my family in this story. The lesson, if there is one, is simply this: sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away. Not because it is easy. Not because it is fair. But because some battles will consume you entirely if you let them, and the fight, even when it is just, can cost you more than winning is worth. But there is an ending. And though I would never have wished it on them, even knowing everything they put us through, it arrived for the Morizes in the form of their own son. You remember August. The boy who bragged about going to military school, the one we nicknamed after the Austrian dictator. As it turned out, August, or Augie, as his parents called him, had been quietly unraveling for years without their knowledge. He had been thrown out of military school. He had been dishonorably discharged from the military. And somewhere along the way, he had fallen deeply into drugs and into violence. One day, he came home. He came home with a sawed-off shotgun. He zip-tied his parents back to their dining room chairs. Then he and a couple of associates went through the Morris home and stripped it of every valuable thing they could carry. And as a final, devastating act on his way out the door, he used the butt of that shotgun to shatter both of his father's kneecaps. No one knows exactly what had turned Augie so completely against the people who raised him. But most of us, if we think about it honestly, can probably guess. He was caught a few days later. He admitted freely to what he had done, but never once explained why. He was sentenced to prison for many years. Mrs. Morris died shortly after, described, in that old-fashioned and heartbreaking phrase, as having died of a broken heart. Mr. Morris spent the remainder of his life in a hospice, unable to walk, and, perhaps the strangest detail of all, he never spoke another word from that night forward. Not a single one. The new family who bought our old home never had to deal with the nightmare next door. The Morizes were simply gone. And the whole terrible, pointless saga became something I return to whenever I need to remind myself of one simple, uncomfortable truth: the pain you cause others has a way of finding its way back to you. Maybe not quickly. Maybe not in the form you would have expected. But it comes. I don't know if I believe in karma. Not in any formal sense. But when I think about the Morizes, about those 5 years of cut hoses and dead birds and 3:33 a.m. music and ransom notes and my little sibling crying in a house they made feel unsafe, I cannot pretend that I don't feel, somewhere deep and quiet inside me, that they received far more than they ever deserved. And I can only hope that somewhere, somehow, Augie finds a measure of peace. Our second story tonight comes from a woman named Celeste, who agreed to house-sit at her parents' home for 6 months while they went on the cruise of a lifetime. She thought the hardest part of the whole arrangement would be loneliness and slow internet. She was wrong. I'll say this right now, loud and clear: I never, in a million years, imagined that something this disturbing could happen to me and my family. But here we are. It started about a year ago. My parents, both newly retired and full of the kind of energy that retired people suddenly discover they have, decided to spend part of their life savings on a 6-month world cruise. Not really my kind of adventure, but they were absolutely giddy about it, and seeing them that excited made me genuinely happy for them. And as an added convenience, the lease on my apartment was ending just the week before they were set to leave. So the timing was almost comically perfect. I would move into my old childhood bedroom and keep an eye on the house for the entire 6 months they were away. This arrangement was a particular relief for my mother, who is, how do I put this kindly, a worrier of Olympic proportions. Without someone in the house, she would have spent the entire cruise calling me and my brother every 5 minutes to ask whether the back door was locked and whether the boiler was making strange noises. With me actually living there, she could sail off into the sunset and rest easy. Oh, Mother! If only you had known. In the week before they left, as I was hauling boxes into my old bedroom, my mother gave me a full rundown of the house, every room, every appliance. Every quirk and consideration, as though I hadn't grown up there. I paid just enough attention to keep her happy. Yes, Mom, I know where the fridge is. Yes, I know the Wi-Fi password. Yes, I'm aware the guest room is stacked floor to ceiling with Aunt Joni's art collection while she navigates yet another divorce, and yes, I absolutely will not throw any of it away. But there was one thing I didn't know about. A new neighbor. His name was Mr. Samuels, and he had moved in a few months prior while I had been away living my life. If you listen to my mother describe him, Mr. Samuels was practically a saint. The loveliest, sweetest, most gentle older man you could ever imagine, she said, and he baked, too. She told me not to be surprised if he came by with muffins, or perhaps even a red velvet cake. Now, I do love a good red velvet cake, so on that basis alone, Mr. Samuels got a provisional pass from me. He also had a nurse who came by every other day, according to my mother, so I needn't worry about him. Not that I had planned to. My mother did enough worrying for the entire extended family. I didn't need to add a neighbor I'd never met to my list of concerns. I didn't get the chance to meet Mr. Samuels before my parents left for the docks, because he was away visiting one of his children at the time. And so I said my farewells, warm but not particularly weepy, and headed back to the house, ready to spend 6 months working on freelance art commissions and watching every streaming subscription my parents paid for that I could never justify paying for myself. Mr. Samuels returned home a few days into my newly established solitude. And I want you to picture the gentle, cardigan-wearing, silver-haired neighbor that my mother had described. Now remove that image entirely. Mr. Samuels was 75 years old. But he was the kind of 75 that makes you do a double take. He was solidly built, confidently spoken, and had the bearing of someone who had spent serious time in the military, which, as it turned out, he had. He was ex-Navy. He almost certainly had a home gym. He did, in fact, have a home gym. At first I honestly wondered why a man that vital needed a regular nurse. And then I saw the nurse arrive for the first appointment, and I gently revised my understanding of what my mother had meant. She is a wonderful, warm, trusting woman, my mother. She is also, occasionally, beautifully naive. Let's simply say the nurse was a particular kind of professional whose specialty lay in relieving tension, and leave that thread precisely there. The man was single, he was 75, and it was entirely his business. In fact, I had a grudging respect for the sheer vitality of it all. He did, as promised, bake a remarkable red velvet cake. And one of his first acts after returning home was to bring one over and introduce himself, a warm and seemingly genuine welcome gesture. But from the very first conversation, something about Mr. Samuels made the small hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I am a 32-year-old woman, and I have spent 32 years navigating the particular discomfort of being looked at in a way that is not a look at all, it is an assessment. Mr. Samuels was doing that the moment he stepped onto the front porch. He made remarks that were dressed up as compliments but carried something far less comfortable beneath them. He said things like how my mother had never mentioned her daughter was so cute, or how he wished he'd known my mother back when she was my age. There was nothing you could directly point to and say, this is wrong, this is inappropriate. And that, of course, was the point. He had an aura around him. I have struggled to describe it precisely, and I still do. It was the sense that he was making absolutely certain I knew that he could overpower me, not as a threat, not stated openly, but communicated with perfect clarity all the same. I have known men like that since I was a teenager in high school. Never once, though, had any of them been twice my age. He wasn't a silver fox. He was something colder than that. A white wolf was the image that settled into my mind, and once it was there, I could not shake it. I tried to limit my interactions with Mr. Samuels to the minimum. He continued to bring baked goods periodically, and it pains me to say it, but eventually I stopped eating them. Not because I had any concrete proof of wrongdoing, but because I had seen a brief video online about a predator who had tampered with food given to women he targeted, and the thought, once inside my head, refused to leave. Looking back now, I am profoundly grateful I listened to that instinct. After about a month of trying to catch up on commissions and chasing down editorial work, the solitude began to get to me a little. My parents called less often than I'd expected, the satellite internet on the cruise ship was temperamental, and half our video calls looked like a slideshow of their faces while my mother shouted my nickname over and over into a patchy connection. To give myself a project, I decided to surprise them by tackling the attic. I knew from family lore that it was an extraordinary mess up there, and beyond the organizational satisfaction, I was hoping to find some childhood memories and perhaps some things worth selling. My brother had left behind old gaming consoles and action figures that I suspected had grown in value over the years. I wasn't up there long before I made two very clear realizations. 1, this was going to be a massive undertaking and would take days, not hours. 2, someone had cut a hole through the drywall between our attic and the adjoining one. And the adjoining attic, of course, belonged to Mr. Samuels. Cables were snaking through the hole. I followed them through the maze of boxes and old holiday decorations with a growing, cold feeling in my stomach. And what I found stopped my breath completely. Holes had been drilled through the attic floor, recently, judging by the pale sawdust still gathered around them. 2 separate wires descended through those holes into 2 separate rooms below. I traced them. The first led to the bathroom. The second led to the bedroom I was sleeping in. Small cameras, concealed inside the shells of fake smoke detectors. Angled and positioned with deliberate, calculated precision, one toward the shower, one toward the entire bedroom. I followed the cables back through the hole and into Mr. Samuel's attic, dreading what I would find. And there it was, a laptop, open, running. With 2 live feeds playing on the screen. I stood there for a long moment, just breathing. This man, this charming, cake-baking, apparently doting neighbor, had been watching me. In the bathroom. In my bedroom. For God only knows how long. He had set this up before I had even arrived. He had prepared. I minimized the live feeds, and I found a folder on the desktop. It was labeled, in his own words, the best of. I wish I could tell you that what I saw inside that folder was anything other than what it was. But it was everything you are imagining. Video recordings of me showering. Video recordings of me changing clothes. And recordings of other private moments that belonged only to me, in the solitude of a bedroom I had believed was safe. I deleted the folder immediately. I emptied the recycle bin. And then, with my hands shaking, I realized what I had just done. I had destroyed the evidence. The clearest, most damning proof I had. I want to tell you that my brain made that decision out of pure shock. And I think that is partially true. But I also know, somewhere in a quieter part of myself, that I made that decision because calling the police terrified me in a way that was not rational to others, but was entirely real to me. And I will explain why in a moment. What I wanted, what I needed, was not just for Mr. Samuels to face consequences. I wanted him to be afraid. I wanted him to understand that someone knew what he had done, and that his sense of power and safety was an illusion. My first move was to cut the wires connecting the cameras. My second move was to reach out to a trusted friend, someone who knew things about computers that I would rather not ask too many questions about. He sent me a piece of software via USB drive that, once installed on Mr. Samuel's laptop, would corrupt not only that machine but any other device connected to the same home network. Completely and irreparably, my friend promised. I knew Mr. Samuels was out of town for a few days, supposedly visiting his daughters again, though at this point I had revised my assumptions about how he spent his time away significantly. He was due back the following day. I moved quickly, installed the software exactly as my friend instructed, and then forced myself back downstairs to wait. I knew the moment he found it. From somewhere above me, through the ceiling and the floorboards, I heard a robotic voice begin broadcasting at full volume from his laptop speakers. The same phrase, over and over again, declaring in flat mechanical tones that he was a voyeuristic predator and that he also, I will not repeat the second part of the phrase, but it related to children, and it was chosen deliberately to be as devastating and public as possible. I heard him frantic above me, heard the laptop lid slam shut. Then I heard his footsteps thundering downstairs to whatever secondary computer he had in the house. And then, a few moments later, the same robotic voice, starting again. According to my friend, the only way to stop it would have been an exceptional level of technical knowledge, something written directly to the root of the system, below where a simple hard drive wipe could reach. A standard reinstall of the operating system would accomplish nothing. I did not think Mr. Samuels, whatever his many talents as a predator and a pervert, had that kind of technical knowledge. I was right. The following weekend, I watched from a window as he dragged the remains of his desktop computer, smashed into pieces, no longer recognizable as a single object, out to the sidewalk for collection. Hilariously, the garbage service did not collect electronics, and so the pile simply sat there until his HOA sent him a notice about unsightly refuse. The following day, a snapped laptop joined it. He knew, I think, that it was me. The baked goods stopped arriving. He avoided my eyes whenever we happened to cross paths coming or going. The whole shape of him had changed, less predatory, more pinched. But I still could not sleep properly. Because no matter how thorough the deletion had been, I could not fully silence the fear that he had already shared those recordings. That copies existed somewhere I would never find. The thought that others might have seen me in my most private moments, people I would never know, in places I could never trace, was a particular kind of horror that has no clean ending. I confided in my friend. He listened carefully, and a few days later, he sent me a smartphone in the mail with instructions to post it through Mr. Samuel's letterbox in the middle of the night and ask no further questions. I did exactly that. Whatever was on that phone, the effect was visible within days. Mr. Samuels became a recluse. He stopped leaving the house with any regularity. The special nurse stopped visiting. The man who had walked with such deliberate, confident menace seemed to have shrunk somehow, smaller, quieter, as though something had been taken from him. Good. My parents returned from their cruise happy, sun-kissed, and blissfully unaware. I said nothing to them. I was ashamed, and I was protective of my father, a mild-mannered man in most circumstances who would, I am fairly certain, have spent the remainder of his years in prison if he had ever learned what the man next door had done to his daughter. A few months after I moved back into my own apartment, my mother mentioned casually that Mr. Samuels had been placed into an assisted living facility by his children. She said it had all happened quite suddenly, that he seemed to have mentally declined within the space of a single year. I said nothing. But I had to work very hard to keep my expression neutral. Now, let me explain the reason I never called the police. When I was in college, I was assaulted. And my experience with law enforcement in the aftermath of that was, as I suspect some of you listening tonight may know from your own lives, not good. I was made to feel responsible. I was questioned about what I was wearing, about how much I had drunk, about how I had behaved with the person who hurt me. I know, with complete certainty, that many officers are compassionate and dedicated and handle victims with enormous care. I know this. But I was not one of the lucky ones. And the thought of sitting in a station and trying to convince someone that the sweet old grandfather figure next door had been systematically filming me, even with the evidence that had existed before I destroyed it, filled me with a terror that I could not argue my way out of. So maybe I did not handle this perfectly. Maybe what I did was legally and morally complicated. I accept that. But knowing what I know about what that man was capable of at 75, the planning, the patience, the deliberate installation of hidden cameras before I even arrived, I can only imagine what he did when he was younger, fitter, and more practiced at not getting caught. And knowing that he is now spending the last years of his life in an assisted living facility, fading a little more each month, spending his days being cared for by people he cannot intimidate. I sleep fine at night. I do still check every room for hidden cameras whenever I move somewhere new. Old habits. If any of this resonates with you, if you've ever had to make an impossible choice about how to protect yourself when the systems that should have protected you didn't, please know you are not alone. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Our third story is a quieter one in some ways. More melancholy than frightening. But it has never left the man who shared it, and I suspect it will not leave you either. Do you have someone in your life you'll never quite forget? Even though you never really knew them all that well? Not a close friend, not a family member, just someone who was simply always there. A constant, familiar presence at the edges of your everyday life. A person you saw so regularly that their face and their habits became a kind of comfortable background noise to your own existence. I think about people like that sometimes. The ones who shaped the texture of your daily life without ever being the center of it. The beloved old chair you found at a second-hand shop, you don't know its history, and it doesn't know yours, and yet somehow it fits perfectly, and the room feels different once it's gone. I realize that sounds like a strange way to think about a person. But I mean it warmly. I hope that someday I am someone else's old chair. Someone they carry a little piece of, without quite knowing why. The man who shared this story carries a piece of his neighbor, Mr. Browning, in exactly that way. And he has carried it since 1985. I remember Mr. Browning clearly. I will always remember him. And even though the last time I laid eyes on him was decades ago now, I think of him with genuine fondness, despite, or perhaps because of, the way it ended. My wife and I used to talk about inviting him to dinner. We'd wonder whether he was lonely after losing his wife some years before we moved in. We'd wonder whether his adult children called regularly, because they never seemed to visit. But we never quite got around to making the invitation. We never quite made the time. And I think that's one of those small, human regrets that doesn't announce itself loudly, it just sits quietly in the corner and waits. I don't even remember his first name, if I'm being honest with you. It was always, "Good morning, Mr. Browning," and he would respond with, "Good morning, Ted." He was my elder. We both understood the unspoken shape of that. He had been a teacher. I think he perhaps saw himself as Mr. Browning regardless, that the formality of the title was simply part of who he was, and that inviting a neighbor to use his given name might not have even occurred to him as something that was missing. Amos. That was his name. Amos Browning. It came back to me from the obituary, and then from the funeral. And I think those were the only occasions I ever heard his first name spoken aloud, and one of the very few times I met his adult children. His son was a doughy-faced man who seemed, somehow, slightly bored to be attending his own father's funeral. His daughter was sharp-featured and efficient, with a meek husband and a grandson who wanted to be the center of attention even at the wake. My wife and I didn't stay long. We'd come to pay our respects to the man himself, not to make small talk with people who, from everything we could gather, had not played much of a role in his life while he was living it. And there was another reason we couldn't stay. I am not a skilled liar. The daughter had clearly already formed some suspicion about my presence, some vague notion that I had been nearby when it happened. And if she had asked me to explain what I had witnessed, I would have struggled to find any version of the truth that was kind enough to say aloud. Mr. Browning and I had a simple, consistent ritual. He would mow his lawn, always with one of those corded electric push mowers, old-fashioned even for the time, though his yard was probably small enough to justify it. And I would lean on the fence and talk to him while he worked. I suggested, more than once, that he should treat himself to a ride-on mower. He always waved the idea away, saying his garden was far too small. It wasn't, particularly. But at his age, early 70s, I would have guessed, the slow, steady work of pushing that mower was good exercise. A little peace and movement in his afternoon. Peace from what, I was never entirely sure, since he lived alone. But that's what he said, and I never questioned it. We talked often, but rarely deeply. We were two men who had found a comfortable groove without any particular need to excavate beneath it. We talked about the Detroit Lions. He was a devoted supporter and I was a casual one at best. We talked about the weather. We talked about politics, though never in any way that invited actual disagreement. We watched some of the same television programs and would debrief on them cheerfully over the fence. We shared a love of music. Miles Davis. The Who. Kiss. He told me once about the first concert he had ever attended, said he had snuck in to watch Kiss play, told it with the relish of someone who had waited years to share the story. I was never entirely certain whether the story was true or lifted from a film I vaguely recognized with a similar premise, but it didn't matter. He told it about 5 times over the years, and I enjoyed it every time. He would occasionally ask about my wife, how she was doing, how her work was going. I always sensed that he wanted to talk about his own wife in return, the one who had passed before we became neighbors, but couldn't quite find the way in. Except for once. Just once, he opened that door a crack, and then gently closed it again. My wife would sometimes bring him a lasagna or something freshly baked. He would thank her with the manners of a man from another era. And he always returned the dishes to me over the fence, never once to our front door, always over the fence, as though the fence itself were the proper channel for all communications between us. I talked to him so often, for so many years, that by the time we eventually moved away, the grass had stopped growing in the exact spot where I always stood to lean on that fence. Now, I remember what we were talking about on the day it happened. My wife had recently had a small operation, a routine procedure to remove a benign cyst. And Mr. Browning was asking after her, as he always did. I told him she was doing well and would likely be home from the hospital the next day, possibly even that evening if her recovery continued as expected. He paused his mowing and looked at me then, in that quiet, direct way he had. And he told me that I was lucky. That I should hold on to a good woman like that. And then he said something else. Something he said looking down at the grass, turning away slightly, as though the words were coming from somewhere private and unguarded. He said, "I miss her so much." Those were the last words he ever spoke. I saw it happen. I saw the change in his expression, a sudden look of alarm, and then of fear. And I believe, though I cannot be certain, that he tried to stop himself. That something in his body recognized, in those last split seconds, what was about to occur. He had always been meticulous about the cord. Always careful. Running the electrical cable around the perimeter of the lawn in the same practice pattern, keeping it well clear of the mower's path. It was muscle memory, the kind of caution that comes from decades of repetition. But something went wrong. The mower ran over the cord and the outlet connector. And something in the grounding failed, the rubber handles that should have insulated him were simply not enough. The live electrical cables tangled into the motor blades. The mower became a conductor. And Mr. Browning, holding on as he always had, received the full force of it. I stood frozen on my side of the fence and watched. I watched his body begin to convulse, watched the smoke rise from where his hands gripped the metal, watched the grass around him blacken and singe. I could smell it, that particular combination of electrical burn and something worse, something that no person should ever have to smell. I knew I had to intervene. I knew that I could not touch him, not while the current was active. I looked around desperately for anything I could use, my eyes landed on an old wooden baseball bat in the yard. I hauled myself over the fence and reached for it. But by the time I got there, it was already over. Mr. Browning had collapsed. He had finally released his grip on the mower, and he had gone down into the scorched grass. I knew, the moment I saw him, that there was nothing to be done. I ran to the outlet and cut the power. And then I went back to him. His face was not something I will describe in detail. But I will tell you one thing that I have never been able to forget, not in all the years since. His teeth were false, and in the violence of what had happened, they had fallen back into his throat. And his eyes, somehow untouched by the rest of it, stared upward, white and still. I ran into his house and called for help. After that, everything became fragmented: paramedics, police, questions. His daughter arrived at some point and looked at me as though I were somehow responsible. As though I, who had stood over her father's body in genuine anguish, were the one who had failed him. When in truth, I thought, her father had spent years wondering whether his children ever called. At the funeral, his son delivered a eulogy that revealed, with painful clarity, that he had barely known his father any better than I did. He spoke in generalities, platitudes that could have applied to anyone. And I sat there feeling an ache that I did not entirely understand, for this man who had talked to me across a fence for years about football and Miles Davis and a Kiss concert that may or may not have happened, and who had never once been invited to sit at his neighbor's table for dinner. I made a quiet promise to myself that day. That when I had children of my own, I would do everything in my power to make sure they wanted me in their lives. Not out of obligation, but because of the relationship we had built together. My wife, as it happened, was unknowingly pregnant at the time of that funeral. We had a son, and then 2 daughters. They are all grown now, with families and lives of their own. My wife and I are grandparents. And we make certain, without fail, without exception, that we keep our family close. Regular dinners together. Christmas and Thanksgiving that are full and loud and warm. That is the legacy of Mr. Amos Browning, in a way that he will never know. We eventually sold the house at a loss. Every time I stepped into the backyard, I smelled that electrical burn and saw those still, white eyes staring up at me from the blackened grass. We moved somewhere smaller, but somewhere that felt only like ours. My son was born in that smaller house, and he has never known the shadow of what came before it. I will always remember Mr. Browning. And part of that means being marked by the worst thing I ever witnessed. But mostly, when I think of him, I think of that groove worn into the grass beside the fence. The place where I always stood. The place where he always mowed. That space meant something. It meant something to me, and I believe it meant something to him. Even if neither of us ever quite said so. Like this video if this story moved you, and share it with someone who matters to you. Let the people you love know that they matter. Our 4th story begins in a perfectly normal suburban neighborhood, on a perfectly normal suburban street, with one notable exception, the house that everyone called the Nightmare House. I want to be clear about something right from the beginning. I am the most ordinary man you can imagine. I work at a bank. I have a wife and 2 kids. I like a good cookout and a quiz night at the local bar. I am not the kind of person who attracts drama. I am not the kind of person who goes looking for trouble. And I have spent the better part of my adult life deliberately, consciously avoiding both. But sometimes you don't get to choose. Sometimes trouble doesn't care about what kind of person you are. Our neighborhood was, in most ways, exactly what you'd want a neighborhood to be. Most of us knew each other by name. We did safari suppers, rotating between each other's houses for courses of a meal. We had quiz nights. We pulled together for the things that communities pull together for, and we minded our own business about the things that were none of our business. It was, as these things go, a pretty good street to live on. And then there was the house next door to mine. The one we called the Nightmare House. The owner had purchased the property some years before any of us arrived on the street, and had then, for reasons no one could explain, simply disappeared. Not literally disappeared, he was alive, somewhere abroad, according to the vague information we had been able to gather. But the house had been boarded up, every window sealed with planks, every door secured, and then left. Left to sit and slowly decline while the garden ran wild and the paint peeled and the whole structure developed that particular atmosphere of deliberate neglect. Old Mr. Peterson on the street could vaguely remember the owner from when the property had first changed hands, many years prior. Since then, nothing. No caretaker. No maintenance crew. No letters from abroad asking whether anyone was keeping an eye on things. Just a steadily decaying building sitting in the middle of an otherwise ordinary residential street like a missing tooth in an otherwise healthy mouth. The garden, front and back, had grown into something close to a small jungle. The boards on the windows were weathered and warped. The whole property had an air of something held very still for a very long time. We joked about it, the way you joke about things that make you quietly uncomfortable. We invented theories about the owner. Maybe he was a vampire living in the basement, orchestrating the entire abandonment as a clever ruse. Maybe he had died years ago and no one had thought to check. Gallows humor, all of it. One of the neighbors eventually contacted the relevant district offices to raise some kind of informal concern, and we were told, politely but firmly, that the owner was alive, living abroad, and within his full legal rights to leave his property in any condition that did not pose a structural or safety hazard. So there we were. And then the graffiti started. It was clearly the local teenagers letting off some steam. The building began to acquire tags, then small murals, then some genuinely impressive and ambitious artwork that, if you squinted, actually improved the look of the boarded-up squat brick building considerably. One piece was clearly a tribute to that famous British street artist whose name I will not mention for legal reasons, and I am almost completely certain it was the work of my own 15-year-old son, who had been asking me thoughtfully about that very artist in the weeks preceding its appearance. So we called it the Nightmare House, but with a kind of affection. It was strange and it was an eyesore and it was a minor irritation, but it was our minor irritation, in a way. Part of the texture of the street. And then the boards over the front door disappeared one day, and everything changed. Murmurs spread through the neighborhood quickly. Had the owner finally returned? Had someone been hired to begin cleaning the place up? Was the property going up for sale? None of the above, as it turned out. Squatters had moved in. In retrospect, it was almost surprising it hadn't happened sooner. The property was practically an open invitation, isolated, unused, clearly unmonitored. Several of us kept a careful watch from behind appropriately discreet windows, not because we were judgmental by nature, but because some of us had young children and wanted to understand exactly what we were dealing with. What we were dealing with was not struggling university students or homeless individuals simply seeking shelter from the cold. The group that had moved into the Nightmare House was something else. Their leader, the one the others called Crunk, was a bald, heavily tattooed man with very few remaining teeth and an almost constant air of low-level menace. When he was outside without a shirt, which was often, you could see the unmistakable evidence of serious and long-term drug use along his forearms. But there was nothing pitiable about him. He was not a man who invited sympathy. When he caught any of the neighbors so much as glancing in his direction, he would erupt immediately, a torrent of aggression, aimed at establishing one simple, clear message: this was his territory now. His rules. His street. The others who lived there were called Blippo, and a man the group called by a nickname I could never quite parse, let's say FJ Jockey, who was missing part of one leg and moved between a rusty prosthetic and an ancient, barely functional wheelchair depending on the day. And then there was Finley, who wore the same unwashed gray hoodie every time we saw him and who left olfactory evidence of his presence for considerable distances in any direction. Finley was, by some margin, the least threatening of the four. He occasionally offered a mumbled apology to a neighbor he had jostled past, which placed him well ahead of the others on the basic human decency scale. But that was the ceiling of his goodwill, because it was Finley, we were almost certain, who was responsible for the small, steady thefts from the neighboring houses. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that could be easily escalated. Bread. Detergent. A bunch of bananas left on a kitchen counter. A mop. Small, essential things that vanished without any evidence of forced entry, leaving neighbors sounding faintly ridiculous when they tried to file police reports about stolen fruit. We did try reporting the squatters themselves to the authorities. Several times. And we learned, through this process, that there are legal protections in place for people occupying a property, protections that, in practice, made it nearly impossible to remove them without the owner of the property making the formal complaint. The owner, who was somewhere abroad and who the police themselves had been unable to make proper contact with, was apparently not going to be filing any such complaint anytime soon. And so the squatters were, as far as the law was concerned, effectively untouchable. Things escalated gradually. My family, my wife, my son, my daughter, and I, bore the brunt of it as direct neighbors. The squatters connected our garden hose to our outdoor faucet and used it to fill a large inflatable pool in their back garden during a period when there was an official ban on hosepipe usage in the area. I only found out because we received an official warning about our property's water consumption. I couldn't prove conclusively that it was them, though the hose had been left neatly coiled near the fence and the pool appeared in their garden overnight. Then I caught them directly. They had snaked an extension cord over the fence from our outdoor electrical outlet to power what appeared to be a vintage, multi-component sound system they were assembling beneath a makeshift awning in their back garden. My wife, wisely, asked me to let it go. I went next door instead. FJ Jockey answered the door, made a lengthy production out of how difficult it had been to answer the door, and informed me that I would need to wait for Crunk. He shut the door in my face. I could hear him calling through the interior of the house, and Crunk's voice responding from somewhere inside, slow and thick and unmistakably altered by whatever he had taken. When Crunk finally appeared, he had bloodshot eyes and a rubber strap still tied around his upper arm. The paraphernalia of his addiction was on plain display, and he made no effort to conceal it. What surprised me was what came next. Crunk apologized. Not just cursorily. He apologized with apparent sincerity, with warmth even, explaining that he had assumed I was the kind of generous and community-minded neighbor who wouldn't mind sharing his electrical connection. He spoke about how electricity was a shared resource that should flow freely among neighbors, about how we were all connected to the same earth. It was the kind of speech that, written down, would sound like obvious nonsense. But the way he delivered it, the cadence, the eye contact, the unhurried confidence, had something in it that I can only describe as genuinely hypnotic. I walked away having agreed to let him continue using the outdoor outlet. It was only standing on my own porch that I fully processed what had just happened. I thought, in that moment, about how Charles Manson had managed to gather so many devoted followers despite being, by any objective measure, monstrous. Some people simply carry that thing. That current. And Crunk, I was beginning to understand, was one of them. Which made him considerably more dangerous than his appearance alone suggested. At our next neighborhood gathering, we discussed trying a different strategy. Rather than fighting these people, what if we tried integrating them into the community? A barbecue, perhaps. An olive branch in the form of burgers and beer. I was hosting the next cookout anyway. Maybe they could just hop the fence and join us. I never got the chance to extend the invitation. The morning after that meeting, I went out to the back porch to prepare the barbecue grill for the coming season. It is a large grill, good 4 feet wide, well maintained, and not inexpensive. The space where it normally stood was empty. And when I looked over the fence, Crunk and the others were grilling on it. They hadn't cleaned it properly. It was smoking heavily and beginning to smell. When Crunk saw me looking, he waved cheerfully and invited me over for a burger. I mentioned, somewhat faintly, that the grill appeared to be mine. He smiled, a wide, gap-toothed smile that had an almost theatrical quality to it, and confirmed that yes, he knew. He said he had borrowed it to give it a proper trial run on my behalf before barbecue season got underway. He assured me they'd clean it thoroughly and return it when they were finished. I felt something in that moment that I have difficulty describing precisely. Like standing on a knife's edge with no good direction to fall. Because everything that had happened, the stolen electricity, the hose, the petty thefts, and now this, had been accompanied by these looks, these overheard murmurs I couldn't quite catch but somehow understood the intention of. A consistent, low-level communication that spelled out what would happen to those neighbors who made themselves difficult. And Crunk had eyes. I have to mention his eyes. They were the eyes of someone for whom ordinary social consequence simply did not register. The way that, in photographs, certain men have eyes that suggest the lights are on but something fundamental is missing. Crazy eyes, the kind that tell you the rules that govern the rest of the world simply do not apply to the person behind them. I went back inside and said nothing. That changed on a weekend when I slept late because I'd been working long hours all week. My wife was out. My son was camping with friends. I called for my daughter, who was 16, and got no response. I made myself a late morning coffee and stepped out to the backyard for a cigarette. I could smell the grill. I could hear the stereo system running from next door. I could hear voices, male voices, female voices, Crunk and the others, some unfamiliar additions. And then, beneath all of that, I heard a voice I recognized immediately. My daughter's voice. Uncertain. Nervous. I looked over the fence. She was in that inflatable pool. Wearing a bikini that I genuinely had no knowledge she owned, and that I would have had very serious words about had I seen it before today, because it covered approximately as much as was legally required and nothing beyond that. And she was 16 years old. And Crunk was in that pool beside her. He was not wearing anything at all. And he was speaking to her in a low, coaxing voice, telling her to free herself, to let go, that there was nothing to be afraid of. Around the garden, several other young women lounged, older than my daughter, but only barely, and several of the men, equally unclothed. A red mist settled over my vision. I grabbed the only thing within reach, a shovel, new and unblunted from disuse, hauled myself over the 6-foot fence, and dropped into the squatter's garden. I punctured the inflatable pool with one precise strike that I am still vaguely proud of even now. And then I pressed the shovel blade against Crunk's throat. Blippo started to rise from where he had been sprawled on the ground, and I told him, very clearly, not to move a single muscle if he valued his friend's continued possession of a head. Crunk, to his credit, kept still. But he started talking. He told me I was overreacting. That I was being a controlling parent. That my daughter was an adult and capable of making her own choices. Through gritted teeth, speaking with the specific precision of a man trying very hard not to do something he cannot undo, I informed Crunk that my daughter was, in fact, 16 years old. Behind me, my daughter was crying. She was apologizing, asking me not to think less of her, begging me to understand. And I told her, truthfully, that I did not judge her, not for a single second. I knew what Crunk was capable of in terms of persuasion. I had seen it myself. But I could not look at her in that moment because I did not trust myself to take my eyes off the man with the shovel against his throat. I told her to get out of the pool, take a towel. Crunk objected that it was his towel, and I responded by pressing the shovel slightly more firmly, and go back to our house. Once she had gone, I stepped back slowly. And I told Crunk and the others, in the clearest possible terms, that my patience was completely and irrevocably exhausted. That they needed to find another property to occupy. That if they came near my daughter, or, in fact, came near anything belonging to my family, there would be no version of what followed that ended well for them. Crunk smiled and said, "May the Lord bless and watch over you." I shivered. I don't know if the Lord he was referring to and I were acquainted with the same one. The squatters did not leave. We had another neighborhood meeting. We generated ideas. We discarded them. Violence was not the answer. The legal routes had been exhausted. We left feeling, collectively, defeated. And then a mysterious solution arrived on its own. One evening when all 4 of the squatters happened to be out, a fire started at the Nightmare House. From what the squatters themselves later speculated to each other, loudly enough to be overheard, a drug dealer they had crossed sent people around with Molotov cocktails. The boards on the back windows had been removed by the squatters over the previous weeks, and the incendiary devices apparently came through those openings. By the time the fire department got the blaze under control, the house was a gutted, charred shell. Uninhabitable. Structurally compromised. No cameras had captured footage of the culprits. No arrests were made. The squatters dispersed. The neighborhood, collectively, exhaled. I celebrated with everyone else. But I celebrated quietly, because I knew something the others didn't. I had installed an outdoor security camera after the incident with my daughter. It covered a significant portion of the neighboring property's backyard. I had told the police that I hadn't gotten around to setting it up yet. That was not true. The footage showed one figure, wearing a beloved and well-known Nirvana hoodie, climbing over the fence from our yard into the squatter's garden with shaking hands. Throwing the bottle through the window. Climbing back over. Disappearing into our house. My son and daughter are twins. My son has always been extraordinarily protective of his sister. After I watched and deleted the footage, I went downstairs and, in front of my son, expressed to my wife how fortunate we all were that the fire hadn't spread to our property, and how whoever had done this really should have been more careful. My wife laughed and said, "Responsible." I looked at my son and nodded. One day I am going to sit down with him and have a proper, serious conversation. I am going to tell him that he must never do anything like that again. That violence is not the answer. That even when you are almost certain the building is empty, almost certain is not certain, and the potential consequences are too enormous to risk. I am going to tell him all of that. But not quite yet. Because the squatters are gone, the property has been demolished, the structural damage finally granted the owner the permission he had apparently been seeking for years, and I have the peace of my own street back. And speaking of the owner, he joined us at the bar one evening and apologized to everyone at length. He explained that he had grown up in that house as a foster child. That he had suffered there in ways he did not detail. That when he had become successful, a software engineer in the early days of the internet, and the house had come up for sale, he had bought it with the full intention of having it demolished. But planning permission had been refused, for bureaucratic reasons he couldn't fight. And so instead, he did the only thing that felt like control, he let it rot. He called it the Nightmare House himself, which made the whole table go quiet for a moment. He said he was sorry for what that neglect had caused us. He had been granted permission, finally, to knock it down. And he planned to turn the land into a dedicated graffiti art area and a skate park, having seen photographs of some of the artwork that had appeared on the building before the squatters came along. He ended the evening by saying that he wished he could find the person who had burned the place down and personally thank them. And then he looked around at all of us, one by one. I took a very measured sip of my drink. I think he suspected. Maybe more than one of us suspected. But it doesn't matter now. The Nightmare House is gone. Its bad memories are gone with it. And somewhere, I have to believe, a man who grew up inside those walls is sleeping a little more soundly. As for the squatters, I don't know what became of them. And given what they put us through, I find that I genuinely don't care. Our final story tonight is an unusual one. Not horrifying in the traditional sense, not dangerous or violent. But it is the kind of story that lives in the mind long after it has been told, that strange, delicious, unsettling category of experience that we might call, what on earth did I just witness, and what did it mean? A little while ago, I moved into an apartment building in a particularly creative part of a particularly creative city. I won't say which one, I'm protective of my own anonymity, but if you know artsy neighborhoods, you can probably narrow it down to one of two obvious candidates. And it is not the New York one. The building was more of a boarding house, really. Only 8 apartments, with the top floor belonging to the building superintendent. The residents skewed heavily toward people who made things for a living, painters, writers, a singer, mixed media artists. And apparently one sculptor. The sculptor lived directly across the hallway from me. Nobody in the building knew their name, or with certainty even whether there was one specific person or several people involved in the work. They were known simply as TT. All capitals. The rest of us frequently gathered in the shared common room on the ground floor for what had evolved into a weekly sort of creative brainstorming evening, discussing art, discussing the world, keeping each other company in that way that artists living in close proximity often do. TT never joined these gatherings. Not once. The mysterious sculptor became, almost inevitably, the subject of intense fascination and increasingly elaborate theory among a building full of people with active imaginations and considerable time between projects. The theories were, without exception, remarkable. One of the painters was absolutely convinced that TT was a famous actor who was using the building as a retreat. When we showed her a photograph of the person she had in mind, she said it was the other one, and we were never able to determine what she meant by that. One of the writers proposed that TT was a ghost, the sort from classic cinema, and that all the sculptures were clay, and TT was simply waiting for the right person to sit down at the wheel and create alongside him. The singer believed TT was a woman who had survived a terrible accident and whose work, which did appear in local galleries and often depicted figures in states of damage or transformation, reflected her own experience of being remade by catastrophe. My own theory was considerably less dramatic. I thought TT was simply a reclusive artist who valued their privacy and had no particular interest in us. TT's work moved in a consistent pattern. A completed sculpture would appear outside the apartment door one day, and shortly afterward, well-dressed representatives from a particular gallery would arrive and take it away. The same gallery every time. Never announced in advance. Just there one day, and then collected. I knocked on TT's door a few times, out of genuine curiosity and neighborly instinct. Occasionally I heard sounds of movement from within. Once I was nearly certain I was being watched through the peephole, and the sensation of it made something small and cold pass through me. But I wasn't going to persist if TT wasn't welcoming the contact. Which is why it surprised me completely when, one Friday evening as I stepped out of my apartment for one of our weekly sessions downstairs, I found TT's door standing fractionally open. Just a crack. Darkness beyond it. I stood there for a moment. Said hello into the gap. No response, though I was reasonably sure I could hear movement somewhere inside. The door being open felt like an invitation, or at least, I told myself it did, and that it was a sufficient justification to take a careful look. I turned on my phone's flashlight, covered it with my palm, and stepped inside. The room was completely bare of furniture. Every surface, walls and floor both, was covered in the kind of heavy plastic sheeting associated primarily with scenes in crime dramas where someone wants very much not to leave any evidence behind. It was not a comfortable visual. But the plastic sheeting was not what stopped me completely. In the center of the room stood a statue. It was not a horror piece. It was not monstrous or grotesque. It was a classical statue of the Virgin Mary, the kind you find in old stone churches and cathedral gardens. Beautiful in form. Serene in posture. Except for the face. The face had been painted to look like a mime. The white paint, the simplified, exaggerated expression, the dark markings around the eyes. A mime's mask on the face of the Holy Mother. I stood looking at it, and I could not shake the absolute certainty, irrational, impossible, and completely real to me in that moment, that the statue was aware of me. That TT was the statue. That the statue was TT. I walked forward slowly. I reached out and tapped it gently. Porcelain. Solid and cool. And then, against every warning my own brain was quietly broadcasting, I began to reach toward the face. Because the face did not look like porcelain. It looked like skin. My fingertips were less than an inch away. And from somewhere behind me, I heard a sound. Muffled, urgent, unmistakably the shape of the word, help. I pulled my hand back immediately and turned toward the only other door in the room. I called out. No answer. I crossed to it, wrapped my hand around the handle, and turned it. The door was locked. And at that exact moment, triggered, I realized later, by the mechanism of the door handle itself, the statue behind me shattered. I spun around. The Mary figure lay in pieces on the plastic sheeting. I approached it carefully, and I looked at what was left of the face. It was latex. A carefully crafted latex shell, painted to mimic human skin with extraordinary precision. Inside it had been a hollow ball, a framework. And now it lay there, broken and ordinary, all its uncanny power dissolved. Then a voice spoke. From a speaker I could not locate, somewhere in the ceiling or the walls. It said, "I am TT. This is art. You are the art. Please leave." I left. I ran down the stairs and spent the next several minutes berating myself for not having filmed a single second of any of it. I gathered the others and we rushed back upstairs together, but the door was closed and locked, and once again I had the specific, unreasonable sensation of someone watching us through the peephole. All of us standing there, being watched, not a word among us. 2 days later, a small sealed safe appeared outside TT's door. The gallery representatives came and collected it without explanation. 2 days after that, a gold-embossed invitation arrived in my mail. A private viewing, before the gallery opened to the public. The invitation was from TT. I went. Of course I went. TT was not there. TT's agent was there. And TT's final piece was ready to be unveiled. It was a video. The video showed me entering the apartment. My face was obscured by a censor bar, my identity protected. But the recording captured my movements from multiple angles, from cameras hidden in the walls and ceiling of that bare, plastic-wrapped room. And then, most disconcertingly, the video switched to a camera positioned inside the statue itself, looking outward from the face of the Holy Mother, showing the world from her perspective. In that sequence, the censor bar disappeared from my face for just a few frames, and my face was replaced by the image of a skull. And then the video continued, me reaching for the door handle, the statue falling. Me crouching to examine the remains, and in that moment, the censor bar disappearing again briefly to show, just for a second, something like an angel carved from pale stone. The final shot was text on a dark background. It read, "Life is clay and you are all my sculpture. Goodbye, TT." The video was shown once and once only that night. I have spent the past year trying to locate a copy, through every avenue available to me. If anyone watching this has any knowledge of TT's work, any connection to the gallery, any record of that night, please let me know in the comments. I need to see it again. I need to understand it. I need to understand what it said about me. The other artists in the building all have theories, and I'll let you form your own. But I'll leave you with this. I have thought a great deal about what TT was trying to communicate. About what it means for all of us, living beside each other, watching each other, being shaped by each other's proximity without any of us ever fully knowing it. Life is clay. You are the art. Maybe the neighbor who never spoke to you left a mark anyway. Maybe the house you drove past every morning on your way to work is still shaping the person you're becoming. Maybe we are all, always, sculpting each other. And maybe that is wonderful. And maybe, sometimes, it is terrifying. But it is always, unmistakably, true. Whatever you think of TT, and there are many theories among us, I'll leave you with the simplest and truest conclusion I've reached about all of us in that building who spent so long speculating about the mysterious sculptor across the hall. Artists are just profoundly, magnificently strange. What do you think TT's video was really trying to say? And which of tonight's stories stayed with you the most? Write your thoughts in the comments, I read every single one. And if you have a story of your own, a neighbor who surprised you, frightened you, changed you, or left a mark you never expected, share it with us. Your experiences matter here. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. We release new narrations regularly, and every one of them is real, and every one of them is worth your time. Until next time, take care of yourself, keep your loved ones close, and remember, the most extraordinary stories are always the true ones.